You've mentioned in various interviews and in your writings that we have to start asking ourselves the question, what is GDP for, instead of merely what is GDP or what is the GDP, in the context of grand macro strategy for countries such as the US. Can you tell us, how do you define, first of all, grand macro strategy versus just macro strategy? And what is GDP for, actually?
Thank you for the questions. So let's get back to, basics. We all know what macro strategy is when we're talking about what we project GDP will be to 1.9, 1.8, etc. What will inflation be? This is the role traditionally of economists and economic policy and politicians who don't really understand either, echoing them, having had advice papers or position papers put on their desks by them. That's macro strategy. Grand strategy is something in the realms of national security or history. It used to be called statescraftship, or even all the way back to Plato's Republic. How to become a king or a monarch. How to rule a political entity. And of course, the economy is part of that, but it's not focused on the economy per se. It's focused on national power, national interests within a competitive international environment, a zero-sum international environment. So that's grand strategy. I believe we're in a world now which is more like the 19th century, again, much more contested, much more zero-sum, partly because of the reasons we just discussed, of the failure of the system to deliver for the middle class within the West, but also because of increased imbalances between countries internationally and the destabilization of the global power structure centered on the US, the military power structure. So as a result, large economies first, small economies second, are having to fuse macro strategy with grand strategy, and you get grand macro strategy, which is basically a modern spin on the old theme of what are we trying to do? What are our national interests? How do we achieve them? And in achieving them, we don't just say, what's GDP going to be next quarter to 1.9? We ask ourselves, what is our GDP for? Is our GDP driven, and I've used this example on many podcasts, is our GDP driven entirely by hairdressing, for example, which theoretically could happen. Everyone could put down all their tools and say, we all want to retrain as hairdressers tomorrow, the entire economy. Well, you'd have a boom in hairdryers and on, swivel seats and on mirrors. Would it leave you internationally in a better or worse position to be a country which said, we are the place everyone in the world comes to for a haircut, but we don't do anything else? And it may sound ludicrous, but most things are when you take them to an extreme. And that actually is a methodology of mine, to see how stupid an argument is by taking it to an extreme. And if it breaks down, it's not a very good argument. So what is our GDP for? And the answer is, most of our politicians still don't have an idea. Most of our leadership class don't have an idea. They understand vaguely that it needs to be more for the middle class now, and it needs to be more for the working class. They don't know how to do that internally, and they certainly don't understand how to do that externally in a competitive zero-sum environment. All the policy mantras they keep referring to, competitiveness, deregulation, etc., some of them have some elements that could work, free trade, but most of them actually don't anymore. They need to have a cohesive, coherent, internally consistent, grand macro strategy for what they want their GDP to be for in a contested world environment that will narrow internal gaps and multiply domestic strength, either individually or as part of a coalition. And very few countries have even begun to grapple with what that means. And I believe the US is one of them.
Before I move on to the next question, something you said, we could be all hairdressers and be just fine as long as GDP doesn't drop. For a while, at least throughout most of my life, when people talk about GDP, it was essentially, let's grow the GDP so GDP per capita also increases. Therefore, we're individually wealthier and the country as a whole is wealthier. And that was the end. Like the GDP growth was an end in itself. And now it seems to be GDP growth is not so much as important as, say, what is GDP producing, let's say tanks versus hairdressers. Is this a bit like, am I understanding you right or correctly?
Absolutely. When you are in an era of national security threats, which I think we can all agree is the case, what you are producing and who you are selling it to, and what other people are producing and who you are buying it from, is critical. And to reiterate, this is the oldest of theories, which I am attempting to sell to skeptical markets under a new package, if you will, or a new label. It's nothing new. It's just that for a generation, since the early 1990s, and you could argue maybe even since the 80s, we have a cohort of economists and leadership globally who have just unlearned all of the key lessons of history. And you see the result around you.